Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
So my name is Andy Bruno. I'm an architect. I live in New York City. I work for the New York City Housing Authority here in New York. In the beginning of 2020, I started a project called One House Per Day, where, just as it sounds, I drew a different house every day for 2020 as a way of kind of slowly and methodically exploring how we can kind of challenge some of the established aspects of how houses are designed in the world, I guess, but especially in the United States where I live.
The reason why I invited you today, it was actually related to this project, which is called One House Per Day, which I thought it was quite specific because, as you said already, it talks about detached houses and the living space within these detached houses. So if you could please introduce what is the project and what did you do? Sure.
I mean, there are kind of two sides to it. One is very personal. It was a way for me to kind of get my own thoughts about this topic out of my head and onto paper. And I think that a lot of young architects, we all need to pay the bills. And so sometimes what we have to do that is not particularly interesting or intellectually stimulating. So it was also kind of a way for me to feel as though I was keeping myself sharp, both intellectually and in terms of like being able to design a nice thing at a time when I didn't particularly have interesting work in my kind of like work life. But it's also has a kind of deeper connection, I think, to the production of housing as a kind of topic of study in the United States, because especially in the United States, and I think that it's probably like this in many other places in the world, the detached house, like the single family house set in a yard with a driveway, is basically like by far the most common type of place for people to live. And a lot of architects want to believe that that is a trend that is reversing, or that we're somehow going to get past that, because there are issues inherent in it, like the suburban developments that most houses are now built in are super unsustainable. They're socially isolating. And so I think a lot of architects want to see the house as this kind of totally obsolete typology that is going to slowly kind of fade into the background as people realize that they want to live in denser cities and stuff like that. But the reality is that in the United States, at least, that is the opposite of what's happening. If you look at statistics on housing construction, every month, the United States government census office puts out statistics on new housing that's being constructed. And every single month after month after month, the number of single family houses is more than double the number of units in multifamily houses that are being built in the United States. So contrary to what a lot of architects want to believe, people in the United States, at least, continue to want to live in houses. And I think that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't take that seriously. So those are the kind of like two divergent but interrelated kind of motivations behind the project.
This was the theoretical or the beginning approach that you had before starting the project. But then practically speaking, you draw 365 floor plans. What's the method that you use for that?
Usually each house would start with kind of like a very basic sort of partie sketch that I had done elsewhere. And, just from the physical act of drawing standpoint, it's very simple. They were drawn by hand in a notebook. I used a mechanical pencil to kind of guide the pen strokes, but there wasn't anything particularly novel or special, I think, about the method through which they were drawn. I think that what attracts a lot of people to the project is simply the seriality of it and the relentlessness of it, that it never took a break. A different thing came out every day. And I think that part of why people like the project is the easiness with which any individual house is digested. I think that taken as a total, like there are a decent amount of ideas in the project, but typically each house would try to boil down to like one idea. And so a lot of the times those ideas repeat. And that's another aspect of the project that attracts people, is that it reduced the pressure on any one, the fact that there were always going to be 365 of them reduced the pressure on any one drawing, because there was always going to be another day and another drawing. There are some cases where like I would do a house and I wouldn't be super happy with it, and the very next day I would do one that was very similar but kind of refined the thinking that the first one was trying to get at. And so, yeah, I think that when you look through the whole project, you'll see a lot of similar ideas. And they're normally about challenging some of the like really established aspects of how we design the house today. Things like isolated rooms arrayed along a corridor is like something that you'll never find in a one house per day house, because it's just this typical way of doing things and it has a lot of kind of unintended consequences. Hierarchies of rooms like, the master bedroom with an attached bathroom. You're probably never going to see anything like that, because the project wasn't about like designing nice houses. It was more about imagining how the architectural typology of the detached house might be able to do more than just kind of house single families.
So you didn't actually have any climate condition or location. It was really more exercise to make you think about different ways to make a detached house.
100%. And, occasionally a house would have a kind of imagined landscape that it would sit in, but much more often it was totally contextual. Because like you say, the project wasn't really about responding to, certain climate conditions or designing kind of optimally for energy efficiency or anything like that. It was more kind of inward looking at the kind of architectural qualities of the house.
And what did you learn by doing this?
I think that if nothing else, by kind of trying to, think about how the house might be organized in a way that didn't conform to the kind of like typical tactic, the relentlessness with which things are kind of designed in this typical way is pretty extreme. So you start to see these, things like the corridor that just like we can't get away from. You start to notice them more, I think.
It gives more privacy to the room, because before we didn't have a corridor, so you had to go through all the rooms, which I saw that's also what you draw in many floor plans. When you study architecture, they don't give you the full idea of how did we arrive where we arrived.
I couldn't possibly agree more that often architectural education, and I've gone through an architectural education, it can certainly, depending on the quality of your instructors, it can certainly serve to reinforce the way that things are just kind of done, like a standard procedure for how things are done. When you never learn that things were otherwise, it's super easy to take things like the corridor. We can come back to that as an example again and again, because I think that it's a very powerful one. We tend to take these things as things that have always existed, that they're like inherent to human nature. But in fact, for those listening who don't know, the corridor is an astoundingly recent invention in human history. It's really only been around for maybe 400 or 500 years in its earliest forms. And it's only been in common use in like in private homes for 200 years. Is partially, I think, a hopeful statement that like nothing is really permanent. Now we're getting into much deeper territory, I guess, but like nothing is necessarily permanent. Like none of these things are based on physical law. And so to me, that opens up enormous possibilities for thinking differently about our everyday lives.
Your project, it's researching option to make a detached house. And I think it's nice also that you draw, which is something that is completely disappearing in our field.
For me, that aspect of it was very therapeutic. The project started before the pandemic. In a lot of ways, it was, if not shaped by the pandemic, it was certainly enabled by the extra time that we all had. I don't know that I could have ever really kept the project up if it wasn't for the fact that for most of 2020, I was working from home. The flip side to that is that, for those of us who like continued to work remotely, suddenly we were already looking at our computer screens quite a bit, and suddenly that had increased even more. And so it was absolutely a way for me to just kind of like detach my physical body from being in front of a computer, which was super therapeutic. But it was also one of the kind of foundational aspects of the project. I felt as though I needed to be drawing more.
So do you think the COVID had also an effect on your project?
Definitely. Like the project, it's not about COVID, but I think that inevitably, like everything else in the world, it was kind of affected by it. So in a lot of ways, I think that the pandemic allowed one house per day to exist, but it also affected the way that the project was playing out. I think that probably after the pandemic really start to affect us here and people started to be working from home, I think that a lot of the designs that you would see that kind of came after that would probably, on average, more often feature a contemplation of like how spaces for life and for work can coexist in the form of the house.
And do you think the pandemic will push people to go live even more in detached houses?
Well, that is a thing that did happen in the United States, and partially because of fear, I think, but also partially because of the freedom inherent in remote work. People were moving from the city out to the suburbs. The prices of single family houses in the United States like skyrocketed because so many people were moving from cities out into more suburban or rural places, because suddenly a lot of people could work from wherever they wanted to. And they decided that they would prefer to be in a house than to be in an apartment.
And you think it's going to stay like that?
I can't say, but I think that fact is somehow indicative of a kind of deeper cultural desire over here. You know, that's a thing that has certainly been constructed, like a lot of desires. It's been manufactured in a lot of ways, but not just in the kind of like advertising milieu that we think of as being the kind of, classic manufacturing of desire. In the United States, there has always been this kind of cultural image of the sort of isolated, stoic, self-sufficient person, rural, isolated piece of land. And that's a kind of image that has been around for hundreds of years. And I think that you can't just shake that. And so that image of like what the kind of ideal person is, or the ideal way of life for an American, it affects the way that people perceive their living space and what is the kind of ideal for where you want to live.
So I think a lot of your project is an exercise of form and style. But sometimes I feel the exterior is more powerful than the interior.
I'm an architect, I'm interested in form, and you can never fully get away from that. If, as I said before, each house kind of embodied a single idea, I like to think that usually that idea had something to do with how architectural form can organize social relationships. But sometimes that idea was just about form. I think that that's okay. I don't think that as architects we need to be so hardcore about like having a deeper idea beyond architecturally in what we do. I don't think that's necessarily important for those two things to perfectly line up all the time, but I think that it is good when the attention is not only given to the outside or only given to the inside.
So how are you using your living space at home, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
So I guess the biggest change is that our dining table is now my very cluttered office. Other than that, things haven't changed all that much. I don't know, my wife and I have always lived a lifestyle that was kind of conducive to how we would end up using the house. For example, the fact that the table turned into my desk. It wasn't a big shift in our behavior. It was maybe a shift in how material is organized, other than the fact that we were both in the house constantly.
What type of value do you give to objects, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
My relationship with objects is complex, and I think that value is an interesting way of putting it. And I think that I'm sure that value in that question is not necessarily referring to like money, but I also think that that's sometimes an interesting frame through which to think of it. So for example, I place a pretty high value on things that are not necessarily like of value to my day-to-day life. $60 for a book is not a big deal to me, but weirdly enough, the things that like I do use every day, I have a weird phobia about spending money on. So like spending $200 every day, I like can't get my mind around it. I think that the kind of daily objects that we use for me have become much more important. Like my coffee pour over is this thing. It's, a totally cheap plastic piece of material, but like it has become, certainly in the lockdown when I was making my coffee every day, like it became this aspect of a ritual in my life. I think that the lockdown put us in touch with the qualities of the objects that we live with in a way that had maybe been kind of unconscious before. I rediscovered my piano. Like, yeah, you rediscovered your piano, but you also really rediscovered something about yourself, that you like to play the piano. I rediscovered my drawing pad. Well, yeah, you rediscovered your drawing pad, but really you rediscovered that you like to draw. I think that was like a really beautiful thing that became super clear in in reading the book about sociable objects and seeing all the contributions that people had made. The last year was really messed up in a lot of ways, but for a lot of people, it entailed this rediscovery of important aspects of who they are that I think was really beautiful. And I think that your project really brought that to light in a beautiful way.
What does sociable objects mean to you, or what make you think they were sociable objects?
For me, it speaks to the kind of shared realities that are created around objects. So I don't know, there are certain objects that everybody knows what they are and how they're supposed to work. And so weirdly enough, they become a way of creating a shared reality. And I think that there's something really kind of interesting and beautiful about that. But at the same time, they're all different. Like, so to bring the coffee pour over back into it, my wife and I use the same coffee pour over. It's the same object, but we get different results. There's a beauty in that too, that everybody knows what you're supposed to do with a coffee pour over, but everybody's relationship with it is slightly different. Yeah, I think that sociable objects are simultaneously this way of creating a shared reality and having your own personal, individual life.